Okay, so we're now going to look at an exposed zip. So an exposed zip is created by creating a placket, which is probably a new bit of terminology to you at the moment, but creating a placket by sewing a piece of fabric onto the right side of your garment and then turning it in to create nice clean edges in which to insert the zip underneath. And it's called an exposed zip because you're deliberately exposing the coils from the underside, as well as maybe some of the tape as well. And these sorts of zips feature quite heavily on coats and jackets and sportswear, but can also be quite a deliberate feature on skirts and tops. So here I've got a metal zip, and it's got metal coils, so I'm going to have to be very careful when I'm sewing this. And I have measured the length and I've measured the width. So the length worked out at 12 centimetres and the width worked out at about 7 millimetres. So I need to transfer that information onto this piece of fabric. Now I'm going to go ever so slightly bigger on both, so 12.5 centimetres in length and about 1 centimetre in width. So I'm going to do that now. Now one of the easiest ways to do this is to just find your centre point. Okay, and then I'm going to take a friction marker or a fabric pen, it doesn't really matter, and I'm going to mark in that 1 centimetre box. Right, so I have now transferred this information over. So the next thing we're going to need to do is place it on our fabric. So obviously if you're making a garment, there will be either tailor tap marks, or there will be a very obvious place that you would put your zip. But the beauty of exposed zips is that you can put them anywhere in the fabric. Because you end up cutting into it, so you don't have to rely on a seam allowance. So in this instance I've just got a rectangle of fabric and I'm going to place it reasonably central to that. I also wanted this exposed zip to be right up against this edge, so I'm only doing 3 sides of a box here. So I'm just going to pin that into position, and I'm going to pin it so that I have access to sew around the box without hitting any pins. So I'm now going to stitch this box. So I have to come down, I'm going to leave my needle in that corner, I'm going to pivot, I'm going to go across, pivot and go back up. Now one of the useful things to do when you come to sewing any sort of box like this is to take your stitch length down. So if you reduce it to say 1.8 to 2 millimeters, you're going to end up with a lot more stitches along this area, and when you get to that corner point you're far more likely going to hit bang on that corner, so you end up with a really beautiful neat finish. There's also going to be quite a lot of strain on this, so having a smaller stitch will really help. So I'm going to stitch this now, and as always you place your needle in before you start stitching. And you want to do some reverse stitches on that as well. Right, so I'm getting quite close to the edge, and I'm just going to walk it in using my balance wheel. Perfect. So with my needle in, I'm going to lift my presser foot, and I'm going to pivot around, and I'm going to do the little bit at the bottom. Again, I'm going to walk it in, needle in, turn it around, and I'm going to pivot. so that's now done. Okay, so we've now drawn this rectangular box, and we now need to cut into it. Okay, but we're not going to cut down the middle all the way to the stitching line here. What we're going to do is we're going to probably come in about somewhere between 1 centimetre and 12 mil, and we're going to cut up to that point and then cut like a Y shape up to the stitching lines in the corner. Now, what's really important about this cutting is when you get to the corner point that you are absolutely trying to get as close as you can to the stitching line without cutting the stitching line. The closer you get, the better and neater the placket will be. And one of the common issues I find with this is that people don't cut far enough and you end up with like lots of puckers. So I'm cutting through both layers all the way up to the bottom of the Y, and then I'm going to cut nice and bravely and slowly up to that stitching line and up to that stitching line. Actually, what I might do is I've left one side with a couple of millimeters spare so I can show you the difference it makes. So once this has been cut, we're going to then turn this piece of material through that hole that you've just created. Okie dokie. And it's a little bit fiddly. It requires a lot of pressing. But this principle here is how you make plackets. Okay, so if you're cutting through a facing to create a nice edge to your to the back of your dress or your top, you'll do it like this. If you want to make a welt pocket, you'll do it like this. This is a really good technique to master. So I'm just going to press this now. And you can probably start to see that the side that I haven't cut all the way to the corner, I don't know if you can see that, if I get it up close here, you can see that it's actually starting to bunch and starting to pucker. And that's because I haven't cut far enough in. So I'm just going to recut that, and then I'll press it and show you what the finished article should look like. So this is the finished article. We have sewn the box and we have finished it off with a placket, so there's no raw edges on the outside of the fabric, which is lovely. So the last thing we need to do now is place the zip. So I'm going to do this from the right side of the garment, simply because we want to make sure that an even amount of zip tape is visible and everything is looking nice and symmetrical. The last thing you want to do is end up inserting a beautiful zip but then realizing once you turn it over to the right side that you've got it in wonky. So let's get this placed on the right side. Okie dokie, so that's looking good. And I'm going to just place a couple of holding pins in to get this neatly into position. And then I'm going to come in from the bottom and pin that there too. Okie dokie. So when you sew an exposed zip, particularly if it's finishing or closing at the top of the garment, there's a very good chance that when you open it, this will be closed up using a bit of binding or a facing or whatnot. So when you come to measure your zip, you will have to take all that into consideration, but I'm just assuming that in this instance that this is probably going to be bound at the top, so therefore these bits of excess tape will all get encompassed into that, and we finished off nice and neatly. But this might not be the case with all exposed zips, so you obviously have to take every case as it comes. So this is now in position, and if I turn it over, you'll see that that's sitting over this placket. I've got a little bit of overhang here, but you can use that to neaten up that bottom edge there if you desire. Now, the only thing that we need to do is we need to sew this in. Now, you've got two choices when you come to sew this in. You can either run a top stitch very close to the edge, come across the bottom and then go all the way up, which is the most common way to do it, or you can sew it in by folding the right side of the fabric over and stitching or understitching your seam allowances to the zip itself, and that will give a seamless finish to your zip. So I've chosen to do the seamless finish on this particular example here, and so one of the things that will really help with this is if you baste along the edges to keep it in place, because having you have to take your pins out in order for you to fold the fabric, and if you're taking the pins out, then you're going to find yourself in a situation where you may lose the alignment of your zip. So what I'm going to do is I am going to with my zipper foot on, I'm going to quite close to the edge, I'm going to run a nice long basting stitch to secure all of this in place before I then do the main stitching. So if I just show you how close it needs to be. So you want it just touching the edge, and we're just securing that in. Now these basting stitches will come out, but all we're doing is just making sure that everything stays in position. So this has been basted on now, which will make my life a lot easier when it comes to the actual stitching. So, so the idea is that we fold the main garment piece over, and then we understitch the seam allowance to the zip tape and the placket. So I'm going to use my zip foot, and I'm going to use this as an example, actually, this side first of all. Now what's really important is that you don't sew on the main garment piece itself. You've got to make sure that your stitches are clear from it, otherwise it's going to catch, and that's not going to look very good at all. So if I position my zip foot here, you should be able to see that it's close to that stitching line or that fold line, but not catching it at all. So I'm going to just start off by running a couple of stitches in, doing some reversing, and I'm going to take it all the way down, as I say, pulling the main garment over that basting stitch to make sure it doesn't catch. So take it nice and slowly. If it feels like it's going to move or catch, stop, readjust. When you get to the bottom, do a reverse stitch. And then that is sewn. So I've finished off the other two sides and I've removed the basting stitches, and this is the final exposed zip. So it is a really pretty way of doing a zip, especially if you've got a zip that's got a fancy design and you wanted to really show it off. But that there is how you do an exposed zip.